What's up, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Catholic Themes in Tolkien. I'm Father Charles, and today we're going to expand upon this idea of Tolkien's sacramental imagination, his sacramental worldview, whereby the material is routinely seen as the vehicle for the immaterial, or the spiritual. The ordinary is the means for the extraordinary. The visible is the vehicle for the invisible. And perhaps nowhere is this seen better than in the elvish artifacts. They're composed seemingly from the elements of the earth, the elements of Middle-earth. And yet, there seems to be something about them that is greater than the sum of their parts. And today we're going to talk about the elvish cloaks, we're going to talk about the lembas bread. In a later section, we're going to talk about the Phial of Galadriel. It's going to get its own separate treatment. But some of the most obviously sacramental artifacts in Middle-earth come from the elves. Tolkien said this in his great essay on fairy stories. Great essay if you've never read it, by the way. It kind of gives you a glimpse into Tolkien's creative process and just what he meant by fairy story as his chosen means of art to get across the kind of stories that he wanted to tell. So he said in the essay that something elvish is needed to really excel at the art. He says, anyone can say the green sun. But to make a secondary world inside which the green sun will be credible, commanding secondary belief will certainly demand a special skill, a kind of elvish craft. As a sub-creator, Tolkien certainly seemed to possess this. Some have said that the Lord of the Rings itself seems to be a kind of an elvish artifact. Light from an invisible lamp. There seems to be some faith everywhere in it, but nowhere with a visible source. And so Tolkien ennobled words to become this sublime story. I mean, he had access to the same words that everybody writing in the English language has access to. And yet, through Tolkien's literary skill, through Tolkien's elvish craft, if you will, he was able to put them together in such a way that something truly sublime and transcendent was created. So in the last segment, we talked about Tolkien's analogy of the church being sort of the bottle for the wine. Sometimes the bottle is dusty, sometimes it doesn't look very attractive, but he says for those who can draw old corks, it need not keep us from enjoying the beautiful contents that are inside. So this is a key element of the sacramental worldview, is that you got these two planes of reality. You know, you've got the spiritual and the material. You know, you've got the visible and the invisible, but they merge. You know, it's not like the one just invades upon the other. It's like they become meshed together in such a way that they almost become indistinguishable. The material is shot through with the spiritual. The ordinary is shot through with the extraordinary. And it's not an either or, but it's a both and. So let's talk about those elvish cloaks. Made of the raw silken stuff that the Galadrim wove, they each include a brooch like a green leaf veined with silver, for fastening them around the neck. It was hard to say what color they were, we are told, for gray with the hue of twilight under the trees they seemed to be. And yet if they were moved, or set in another light, they were green as shadowed leaves, or brown as fallow fields by night, dusk silver as water under the stars. When Pippin asks if they are magic cloaks, the elvish leader answers, I do not know what you mean by that. They are elvish robes, certainly, if that is what you mean. Leaf and branch, water and stone. They have the hue and beauty of all these things under the twilight of Lorien that we love. For we put the thought of all that we love into all that we make. They should serve you well. They are light to wear and warm enough or cool enough at need. And you will find them a great aid in keeping out of the sight of unfriendly eyes, whether you walk among the stones or among the trees. The elf goes on to tell them that they must indeed enjoy the high favor of Galadriel, since she herself and her maidens made them, and never before have we clad strangers in the garb of our own people. So as we read on in the story, we certainly come to see the benefits of the elven cloaks. More than once do they get the members of the fellowship out of a jam, through the camouflage that they offer, through the warmth that they offer, etc. It's interesting to note here how the elf responds when they ask about magic. He says, well, I don't really know what you mean by that. And the reader is kind of left wondering too. You know, one of the great things about fiction is that it can deal in ambiguities. And life deals and ambiguities, and I think that's one of the reasons why fiction is such a great vehicle for portraying truth. So, the reader's left kind of wondering, so are they magic or aren't they? Well, we're told that Galadriel wove them out of the stuff of the earth. They're made out of cloth that comes from Middle Earth. So for me, the interesting point about the elvish cloaks is that they're woven out of the ordinary threads of the earth, but they carry with them some sort of quasi-supernatural properties. The visible becomes a vehicle for the invisible. The ordinary becomes a vehicle for the extraordinary. The next example goes further and meets deeper needs. Another parting gift from Lothlorien is the lembas bread. We're told the food was mostly in the form of thin cakes made of a meal that was baked a light brown on the outside and inside was the color of cream. Gimli takes a nibble, assuming it to be cram, an inferior type of bread of human origin, and he discovers its taste to be delightful. And he probably eats a little bit more than he should have. The elves explain, we call it lembas, or whey bread, and it is more strengthening than any food made by men, and it is more pleasant than cram by all accounts. They go on to counsel restraint in eating it, urging it to be eaten only a little at a time and only at need when other foods fail. The cakes will keep sweet for many, many days if they are unbroken and left in their leaf wrappings, as we have brought them. One will keep a traveler on his feet for a day of long labor, even if he be one of the tall men of Minas Tirith. And as it turns out, the lembas bread will prove crucial for the success of the quest, particularly for Frodo and Sam and their long journey to Mount Doom. In the Mount Doom chapter, after days on end of weariness and trials for Sam and Frodo, we're told, the lembas had a virtue without which they would long ago have lain down to die. It did not satisfy desire, and at times Sam's mind was filled with the memories of food and the longing for simple bread and meats. And yet, this whey bread of the elves had a potency that increased as travelers relied on it alone and did not mingle it with other foods. It fed the will and gave strength to endure and to master sinew and limb beyond the measure of mortal kind. So Tolkien's description of these virtues of the lembas bread, especially its extra potency when fasting and its curious power to revive spirits when otherwise feeling tempted to simply lay down and die, has caused some to see parallels with the Eucharist. As seen earlier, Tolkien did refer to communion as a cure for sagging faith, and he indicated that his own life as a Catholic was based on and largely preserved through it. He once addressed the link between the Eucharist and lembas in an unsent letter, mentioning that a critic once proposed this connection. And while not denying it, Tolkien's brief comment was simply to say, far greater things may color the mind in dealing with the lesser things of a fairy story. And so from this typically humble response, Tolkien seems to have viewed his creative work as a lesser thing when compared with far greater things than the Eucharist. So I want to get into this here because earlier we talked about the fact that Lord of the Rings, very clearly, according to Tolkien, was not an allegory. An allegory is where one thing stands directly for another. It's the reader's job to kind of figure that out. So there's a right interpretation and basically amounts to kind of a lesson. And Tolkien thought that this was kind of a way of imposing on the reader and not really respecting the reader's freedom. So it is a very interesting question. The first time I read it, I kind of thought about the Eucharistic connection. I would argue that the lembas as a literary device is deeply Catholic, but not as a Eucharistic allegory. There's simply too many differences for the allegorical claim to hold true. So for Catholics, for instance, the Eucharist is derived from ordinary bread that is consecrated by a priest within the specific liturgical context of the Mass, using specific and ancient verbal formulae, during which time its substance changes into the body of Jesus. Its reception takes place communally at the hands of a priest or another minister, again within the same ritual context. Its consecration is preceded by a gathering of intentionally worshiping fellow believers. And there's a reading of sacred texts, and there's a sending forth on mission at the end. So none of that context is present with the lembas bread. For the Catholic, the effects of the Eucharist are believed to be a mystical uniting of the believer receiving the host with the entire body of the faithful and to the Trinitarian Godhead itself. In The Lord of the Rings, it is true that the lembas is given, but it's a singular occurrence by Galadriel and her kin, and it's usually eaten in a small assembly of two, at least. However, there's no priest, there's no liturgy, there's no divinity, other than Eru Iluvatar, whom we only learn about by reading the Silmarillion. And this god is never prayed to, he's never worshipped as a god, and no evidence is given or suggested that anyone thought him to be present in the lembas bread. Its salutary effects, while extremely helpful, do not include direct union with God. So none of this is to deny its beauty and power, nor even the deeply Catholic sentiments of the lembas bread. Its Catholicity, so to speak, is more a result, though, of its sacramental quality in general. It's a tangible, made artifact of the elves that mysteriously contains elements which transcend its mere physical properties. Again, kind of going back to the elven cloaks. Are they magic? They possess properties that would seem to be unexplainable by merely physical properties alone. And yet, where do they come from? Well, the lembas cakes come from the earth. They come from the ingredients of the earth. The lembas is a visible sign of an invisible reality. It's something material housing something spiritual. It's something comprised of ignoble elements of the earth that are ennobled through elvish artifice towards something with power to feed not only the body, but the will. So the sacramental quality of the lembas bread, to me, is more like the types found in the Old Testament. A type is a person, place, or an event, or an institution in the Old Testament that foreshadows the person and work of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. So, for instance, the manna in the desert in the book of Exodus is a type of the Eucharist. Noah's Ark is a type of the saving church, and the flood is a type of the cleansing and saving effects of baptism. The story of Abraham and Isaac is a type of Jesus' sacrifice on Calvary, whereby a father sacrifices his son. Since The Lord of the Rings takes place in a pre-Christian world, things like lembas bread make a lot more sense to me, pointing forward rather than backward. That is, they make sense in the light of a future revelation, rather than as signs or vehicles of a divinity that has already come. By retaining the logic of sacrament while opting for the pre-Christian setting, Tolkien wisely avoids doctrinal conundrums, potentially distracting or contrived allegories, things of that nature. So I hope I didn't disappoint any Catholics out there. I've thought a lot about the lembas connection. You would think that as a Catholic priest, I would be the first one to jump on the allegorical interpretation. But again, I think it's deeper than that. I think it's once again this idea of the ignoble elements of the earth, if you will, that in the expert hands of the elves somehow can be fashioned into artifacts, creations, objects that have qualities that transcend the sum of their parts. But again, the visible contains the invisible, if you will. What is it in Lothlorien that is so special? Well, somehow, whatever that is, it's woven into the threads of the elvish cloaks. And a little bit of that power that is present in Lothlorien is present in the cloaks. A little bit of the power of the lady, if you will. Same thing with the lembas bread. The same sort of effects on the spiritual well-being of the visitors to Lothlorien are contained in this traveling way bread for the members of the fellowship, particularly Sam and Frodo as they proceed on their journey. For a deeper treatment of this, again, I would refer you to On Fairy Stories. So now we come to the horns. Horns, particularly the horns of Rohan, serve as another example in The Lord of the Rings as a kind of a quasi-sacramental object. Though in a different way than the elvish artifacts, the horns, though well crafted, do not possess any type of elvish magic, if you will. They're human creations, pure and simple. Their great virtue lies in their power to summon courage and dispel despair. Tom Shippey, who wrote extensively about this, said that the horns mean defiance, recklessness, going on even when there is no hope, a quality which Tolkien saw as one of the chief virtues of the Norse people in the Norse legends. Boromir's horn of Gondor is first described in the Council of Elrond as a great horn tipped with silver. Later, when the Fellowship makes ready to set out from Rivendell, he says, "Loud and clear it sounds in the valleys of the hills, and then let all the foes of Gondor flee." He then blew a blast, earning him a mild rebuke from Elrond, who insists that it should only be blown in the hour of need. "A maybe," answers the proud Boromir, "but always I let my horn cry out at setting forth, and though thereafter we may walk in the shadows, I will not go forth as a thief in the night." Later in Moria, the winding of Boromir's horn even temporarily checks the Balrog. The great horn of Helm rings out at the decisive moment of the Helm's Deep battle, just as a blast of fire destroys the gate and scatters the barricade, and hordes of orcs are preparing to flood in. It's at this moment, when defeat seems imminent, the horns signal the turning of the tide. All that heard that sound trembled. Many of the orcs cast themselves in their faces and covered their ears with their claws. I love the scene in the film when Gimli, I thought it was a nice touch, having Gimli blow the main horn of Helm. Then the answering calls of the other horns follow, blast upon blast, as if on every cliff and hill mighty heralds stood. Ever the horn blasts wound on among the hills. Nearer now and louder they answered one to another, blowing fierce and free. Theoden and his army ride out to meet the challenge of the orcs, and none can withstand them. Then at last Gandalf arrives, the White Rider, with Erkenbrand and his men, amid the continuing horn blasts, as the terror of his coming filled the enemy with madness. Their ensuing victory of the orcs was swift and decisive, aided by the Huorns, not to be confused with the horns. Huorns, the tree people, the trees, the former Ents. It's never quite explained, but anyway, wouldn't want to be caught up in their wrath like the Uruk-hai were. Perhaps the greatest moment for the horns is at the ride of the Rohirrim at the dawn of the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. Can we just take a moment here and just give reverence, give respect, give awe and admiration for the magnificent way that this was treated in the film?
Courage, Merry. Courage for our friends.
Form ranks, you maggots! Form ranks! Pikes in front! Archers behind!
Hey, man! Take your Eowyn down the left flank! Gimli, follow the King's banner down the center. Remote, take your company right after you pass the wall. Forth, and fear no darkness! Arise! Arise, riders of Theoden! Spears shall be shaken! Shields shall be splintered! A sword day! A red day! And the sun rises!
Whatever happens, stay with me. I'll look after you.
Ride now! Ride now! Ride! Ride for ruin and the world's ending! Death!
So in the book, just as the Witch King, the Lord of the Nazgul, has ridden into the breach gate of Gondor to declare victory, there come the sound of horns, horns, horns. Great horns of the north wildly blowing. Rohan had come at last. This is the moment of Theoden's great triumph and definitive moral victory. The moment where he fully returns to himself to embody his royal authority and glory. His despair is fully vanquished, and he rides with his men to meet the foe and his own destiny. This follows a speech delivered in a loud voice, quote, more clear than any there had ever heard a mortal man achieve before, after which he seized a great horn and blew such a blast upon it that it burst asunder. And straightway all the horns in the host were lifted up in music, and the blowing of the horns of Rohan in that hour was like the storm upon the plain and a thunder in the mountains. So later on in the story, after the ring's destruction and the gladness of Aragorn's coronation, as the members of the hobbits make ready to return home, Éowyn insists on giving a parting gift to Merry. Now, this is something that was not in the movie, the whole cleansing of the Shire. That was just omitted because the Return of the King was already 3.5 hours long. I get it. But it's kind of unfortunate because the scouring of the Shire is very much of a decisive moment. It kind of puts the seal on the there and back again twist, which mirrors The Hobbit. The hobbits come back to the Shire all grown up, ready to defend it and reclaim it for themselves. So this horn of Eorl the Young that Éowyn gives as a parting gift to Merry, we're told, is an ancient horn, small but cunningly wrought, all of fair silver, with a baldric of green, and writes had engraven upon it swift horsemen riding in a line that wound about it from the tip to the mouth, and there were set runes of great virtue. Éowyn explains that the horn is a great heirloom of her house, made by the dwarves, retrieved from a conquered dragon. She says, he that blows it at need shall set fear in the hearts of his enemies and joy in the hearts of his friends, and they shall hear him and come to him. And so as it turns out, Merry's blowing of this horn will summon the courage of the hobbits to at last successfully defeat Saruman and his thugs at the Battle of Bywater. The Scouring the Shire is an important chapter in the story because, again, it signals the final arrival of the hobbits. You know, Gandalf doesn't go with them. He says, you guys got this. You're big boys now. You're all grown up. And you have everything you need to reclaim what is your own with the help of the Horn of Eorl. So some scholars have pointed out that the demoralized and industrialized Shire that the hobbits return to mirrors the situation of post-war England. Tom Shippey described this as indicative of a more general situation, quote, a society suffering not only from political misrule, but from a strange and generalized crisis of confidence. We see the leaderless, bewildered hobbits being inspired after Merry blows the horn. Shippey says immediately the paralysis dissipates, everyone seems to wake up. So in this context, Shippey describes the effect of the horns in a manner which perhaps underscores their sacramental character. Now, Tom Shippey doesn't go so far as to call it a sacramental effect, but when you hear it, be thinking about the things that we've said, about sort of the visible being the carriers of the invisible, the physical being the vehicle for the spiritual, if you will. He says, inside the Lord of the Rings, the Horn of Rohan stands for a rejection of the despair, which is Sauron's chief weapon, and which hangs so persistently on the edges of the story. Outside the Lord of the Rings, it maybe stands for the Lord of the Rings. If Tolkien were to choose a symbol for his story and its message, it would be, I think, the Horn of Eorl. He would have liked to blow it in his own country and disperse the cloud of post-war and post-faith disillusionment, depression, acquiescence, which so strangely and twice in his lifetime followed on victory. And perhaps he did. So again, these horns, they're not sacraments, so to speak. On one hand, you could argue that they're just a kind of a cool thing that the Riders of Rohan used, that the men of Gondor used, like the Horn of Boromir. You can just say that it was just part of their way of doing battle. It was a way of summoning their courage. But you can see that the horns, when blown with the right spirit at the right moment, they contain an almost spiritual significance and power. Again, like the lembas bread, they feed the will. They overcome despair. They have an almost quasi-supernatural effect on the one who hears the horns. I love how Tom Shippey says that the Lord of the Rings itself is kind of like one of these horns that bids us to shake off postmodern despair and take our place in the great moral and spiritual battles of our time. Another sacramental object, and perhaps in all of the Lord of the Rings, the one that's most applicable to the idea of a sacrament would be the Athelas plant. It's first introduced in the Fellowship of the Ring during the Flight to the Ford chapter. Strider's tending to Frodo after the notched knife wound he suffered from the blade of the Witch King on Weathertop. From the pouch of his belt, Strider drew out the long leaves of a plant. He crushed a leaf in his fingers, and it gave out a sweet and pungent fragrance. It is fortunate that I could find it, for it is a healing plant that the men of the West brought to Middle-earth. Athelas, they named it, and it grows now sparsely and only near places where they dwelt or camped of old. And it is not known in the north, except to some of those who wander in the wild. It has great virtues, but over such a wound as this, its healing powers may be small. So Strider puts the leaves into boiling water and he bathes Frodo's wound. And we're told, the fragrance of the steam was refreshing, and those that were unhurt felt their minds calmed and cleared. So we get a little foreshadowing of the potent healing effects of the Athelas plant, and these are going to come into greater focus in the Return of the King. In the Houses of the Healing chapter, Yorith, one of the old wives who tends the sick, weeps over the badly wounded Faramir. She says, "Alas, if he should die! Would that there were kings in Gondor, as there were once upon a time, they say. For it is said in old lore, the hands of the king are the hands of a healer. And so the rightful king could ever be known." To which Gandalf excitedly replies, Men may long remember your words, Yorith, for there is hope in them. Maybe a king has indeed returned to Gondor. So when Aragorn arrives, he urgently bids Yorith to go and fetch some of the Athelas plant. She's unfamiliar with it, so Aragorn says, well, it's also called King's Foil, and maybe you know it by that name, for so the country folk call it in these latter days. Yorith says, oh, that. She expresses skepticism that such a mean, mundane plant should have any special healing properties, and she questions the appropriateness of its name. If I were a king, I would have plants more bright in my garden, she says. An increasingly impatient Aragorn replies, and now, dame, if you love the Lord Faramir, run as quick as your tongue and get me King's Foil if there is a leaf in the city. The leaf is at last fetched and brought by Birgil, son of Baragond. He is regretful that it's not fresh, but a smiling Aragorn says it will serve. The worst is over. Stay now and be comforted. Then it says, taking the two leaves, he laid them on his hands and breathed on them. And then he crushed them, and straightway a living freshness filled the room, as if the air itself awoke and tingled, sparkling with joy. And then he cast the leaves into bowls of steaming water that were brought to him, and all at once hearts were lightened. For the fragrance that came to each was like a memory of dewy mornings, of unshadowed sun, in some land of which the fair world in spring is itself but a fleeting memory. But Aragorn stood up as one refreshed, and his eyes smiled as he held a bowl before Faramir's dreaming face. So we see that the effect is immediate. Faramir stirs, he sees Aragorn standing over him, and he says, my lord, you called me. I come. What does the king command? To which Aragorn replies with gentle authority, walk no more in the shadows, but awake. So the parallels to the Catholic sacrament of the anointing of the sick here are pretty striking. A rather ordinary and unregarded plant becomes in authoritative hands an agent of healing of body and spirit, much as in the sacrament of the anointing, ordinary oil from the olive becomes, in the hands of the priest, a healing agent. Faramir's ailment is not only physical. He suffers not only from a Southron arrow wound, but also from the Black Breath, a mysterious yet deadly affliction which he procures during his close conflict with the Nazgul at the gates of Minas Tirith. Aragorn observes certain rituals in administering the Athelas remedy, such as laying the leaves on his hands and breathing on them. The virtues of the plant in the healing and kingly hands of Aragorn seem to affect not only the wound, but also demonstrably dispel spiritual and existential darkness. The plant will prove effective for aiding in the cure not only of Faramir, but also Merry and Éowyn. So, like the elvish sacramental artifacts, the Athelas plant is of high and noble origins. It was imported to Middle-earth from Númenor by the men of Westernesse, Aragorn's lofty and royal forebears. It's a material vehicle for the spiritual, a visible agent of the invisible and mysterious powers. However, a chief difference between the Athelas and the elvish artifacts is that unlike the elvish artifacts, which are lovely to behold and are manifestly special, The Atlas is unregarded and unknown, and there's nothing notable or extraordinary about its visible appearance. For those who are even aware of it, it's only king's foil, a weed with few virtues. It certainly is not seen as a potent agent of healing that it becomes in the hands of Aragorn. The hidden nature of this ignoble weed, much like Strider himself, does not become manifest until the time is ripe and it is most needed. So again, this discussion of sort of mediating objects, I think illustrate a certain sacramental worldview in Tolkien. You know, there's some Christian traditions who would say that, you know, God doesn't need mediating artifacts. God doesn't need mediating objects. There's some who look upon the Catholics, you know, let's say the fact that we have, you know, ornate Gothic churches with stained glass windows, statues, that we have a pope, that the priest wears vestments, that we use incense at certain high liturgies, that we ring bells at certain intervals at the Mass. All these things, I think, to some Christians and non-Christians, why are Catholics investing so much in these sort of ignoble things? These are just human trappings. God doesn't need those things. And it's probably true that God doesn't need them, but maybe we do. Maybe God knew that. You know, getting back to my very first story. Can God save us any way he wants? Well, probably. He's God, right? He can do anything. But when Jesus ascended to heaven, he told his disciples, go and baptize all nations. Go and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So Jesus himself said, baptize, use the water. God is the one who chose to take the mean, humble, material elements that are very ordinary and use them for the vehicle for his extraordinary. So that's what the sacramental worldview is for Catholics. One other thing I want to mention in this discussion before we wrap up, I think it's a little bit of a stretch, but I want to mention it anyway because I find it very fascinating. It's the sacrament of confession, if you will, at Boromir's death scene. You know, here at Boromir, he tries to take the ring from Frodo, then he dies heroically defending the hobbits. He certainly redeems himself and makes good on his promise to protect and serve in the end. But it's very important to him that he confess. And not just that he confess, but he confesses to Aragorn, and he recognizes the authority of Aragorn, and he calls him my king. And it's this beautiful line in the book. It says he smiled when Aragorn said, you know, you have fought well, you have fought bravely. And it's the implication is that he's forgiven and he can be at peace. And in the movie, it was actually even, I think, taken a step further, where Aragorn does this gesture on his forehead, kind of like a sort of a quasi sign of the cross. I have no idea if that's what Peter Jackson was going for. But again, that was another, I think, striking sign of sort of the sacramentality, if you will. It even says in the book that these last words of Boromir, Aragorn long kept secret. When a priest hears confessions, he's sworn under the most serious of oaths to never break that seal. So whatever the penitent says, the priest can't give away. So I thought that was another little nod to Tolkien's Catholic understanding. So maybe you buy it, maybe you don't. But I love the fact that Tolkien routinely and frequently in his story uses the humble, uses the ignoble as the means of conveying the noble. Tolkien uses the visible as sort of the mediator of the invisible. You know, the Eru Ilúvatar figure, the God figure, is never mentioned by name in The Lord of the Rings. You have to go to the Silmarillion to learn about him. But sort of the inherent properties of him and the Valar and all of the beauty of the undying lands, which is kind of like analogous sort of to heaven, is mediated to Middle Earth through these artifacts, through these objects. So I think it's pretty cool. I think it's the way that Tolkien allowed his Catholic sacramental understanding to be absorbed into the story and the symbolism. Coming up, we have a discussion on the ring as anti-sacrament. See you next time. Father Charles, out.